The warm summer breeze carried the sound of gospel music through the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Heights. Sarah Bennett stood in her spacious backyard, clipboard in hand, checking off items from her extensive preparation list. At 42 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her dark skin glowing in the afternoon sun as she directed volunteers who were setting up tables and chairs for tomorrow's charity event. "Please make sure we have enough space between the tables," Sarah called out to a young volunteer. "We're expecting over 200 people tomorrow." Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had organized countless successful events before. This was to be the 10th annual Hope's Kitchen fundraiser, an event that had grown from a small backyard gathering to one of the most anticipated charity functions in the community. Sarah had started it after seeing too many homeless people struggling to find their next meal. What began as a simple food drive had evolved into something much bigger, helping thousands of people over the years. As the setup continued, Mrs. Thompson, Sarah's elderly neighbor from 2 houses down, peered over her fence with disapproval. The old woman had never bothered to learn about Sarah's charitable work in the 3 years since Sarah had moved to this predominantly white neighborhood. All Mrs. Thompson saw was what she considered disruption to her usually quiet street. "Turn that music down," Mrs. Thompson shouted, her thin voice carrying across the yard. "Some of us want peace and quiet." Sarah sighed, having dealt with similar situations before. She walked towards the fence, ready to explain about the charity event, but Mrs. Thompson had already disappeared inside her house. The music wasn't particularly loud, just loud enough for the volunteers to enjoy while they worked. Minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of Sarah's house. Officer Jenkins stepped out, looking uncomfortable as he approached the backyard. He had responded to several calls from Mrs. Thompson before and knew they were often exaggerated. "Ms. Bennett," he said, tipping his hat, "we received a noise complaint." Sarah turned down the music immediately, even though it was only 4:30 in the afternoon, well within the city's noise ordinance hours. "I apologize for any disturbance, Officer Jenkins. We're setting up for tomorrow's charity fundraiser. All the paperwork and permits are in order." She reached for her folder containing the necessary documentation. Officer Jenkins shifted his weight from one foot to another. "I understand, Ms. Bennett, but I still have to issue a citation. Mrs. Thompson has filed a formal complaint, and I'm required to follow procedure." He pulled out his citation book, looking genuinely regretful. Sarah accepted the citation with grace, though her heart sank at the unfairness of it all. She had followed every rule, obtained every permit, and still found herself being penalized. The citation meant she would have to appear before Judge Harrison, known throughout the community for his strict interpretation of local ordinances. As the officer left, Sarah's daughter Tamika, home from college for the summer, came to stand beside her mother. "This isn't right, Mom," the 20-year-old said, anger evident in her voice. "They're just trying to stop us from doing something good for the community." Sarah placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Sometimes people fear what they don't understand, baby. We'll keep doing what's right, regardless of how others react." She turned to address the volunteers who had stopped working to watch the scene unfold. "Let's continue setting up, everyone. Just without the music." The rest of the afternoon passed in relative silence as they completed the preparations. Tables were arranged in neat rows, chairs were set up, and decorations were placed carefully around the yard. Sarah's mind occasionally wandered to the upcoming court appearance, but she refused to let it dampen her spirit. That evening, as the sun set and the volunteers left, Sarah sat on her back porch looking at the transformation of her yard. Tomorrow, this space would be filled with people from all walks of life, coming together to support those in need. The citation lay on the table beside her, a reminder that even the best intentions sometimes face unexpected obstacles. Little did Sarah know that this citation would lead to events that would change not only her life, but also the perspective of one of the most influential figures in their community. As she finally headed inside for the night, she said a small prayer, not for herself, but for those who still needed to learn that community service knows no color boundaries. The county courthouse stood tall and imposing on Monday morning as Sarah Bennett climbed the stone steps. She was dressed professionally in a navy blue blazer and matching skirt, her natural hair neatly styled. Several people rushed past her, but she maintained her calm, dignified pace. The citation paper was carefully tucked inside her leather portfolio, along with all the permits she had obtained for the charity event. Inside the bustling courtroom, Judge Michael Harrison sat behind his elevated desk, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him an appearance of stern authority. At 65 years old, he had served on the bench for over 2 decades and had earned a reputation for being a by-the-book judge. His courtroom ran like clockwork, with most cases wrapped up in less than 10 minutes. Sarah sat quietly in the third row, observing as Judge Harrison handled case after case. His responses were quick and decisive, showing little patience for excuses or long explanations. A young man who tried to explain why he was speeding was cut off mid-sentence. A woman attempting to contest a parking ticket was dismissed with a stern lecture about reading signs properly. Case number 47, Sarah Bennett, noise violation, the court clerk called out. Sarah stood up, smoothing her skirt as she walked to the podium. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his papers as she approached. Miss Bennett, you're here regarding a noise violation that occurred at 1247 Oakwood Heights on Saturday afternoon. How you played? His voice was flat, mechanical, as if he'd said these words 1,000 times before. Your Honor, I would like to explain the circumstances, Sarah began, her voice clear and respectful. She reached for her portfolio to show the permits. Judge Harrison held up his hand, stopping her. The question is simple, Miss Bennett. How do you plead to the noise violation? Not guilty, Your Honor, because I had all the necessary permits for. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison interrupted, looking at her over his glasses. The citation indicates that a neighbor filed a complaint about excessive noise. The responding officer confirmed the noise level was disruptive to the neighborhood peace. This is a straightforward case. Sarah tried again. Your Honor, if you would just look at the documentation. Ms. Bennett, his voice grew firmer. This court's time is valuable. The fact is, you disturbed your neighbors with excessive noise. The officer's report is clear on this matter. In the gallery, several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young law clerk at the side of the courtroom frowned slightly, noticing how quickly the judge was moving through this case compared to some earlier ones. The fine will be $500, Judge Harrison declared, already reaching for his gavel. And let this serve as a warning about future disturbances in your neighborhood. Sarah stood her ground, something in her dignified posture making several observers take notice. Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe I have the right to present evidence in my defense. Judge Harrison paused, his gavel hovering above the sound block. Something in Sarah's calm determination made him hesitate, if only for a moment. But years of handling what he considered routine cases had hardened his approach. Evidence noted and overruled, he said firmly. This court has a full docket today. The fine stands at $500, payable within 30 days. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. As Sarah gathered her documents, she noticed a reporter from the local newspaper, James Martinez, watching the proceedings with interest. He had covered several of her charity events in the past and seemed troubled by what he had just witnessed. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah held her head high, even as frustration and disappointment threatened to overwhelm her. The fundraiser had been a huge success, raising over $100,000 for the homeless shelter, but this fine felt like a bitter ending to an otherwise wonderful event. Behind her, she heard quick footsteps. It was James Martinez, the reporter, hurrying to catch up with her. Miss Bennett, he called out. I think there's something the judge needs to know about your event. Would you mind talking to me for a few minutes? Sarah turned, seeing a glimmer of hope in the reporter's earnest expression. Perhaps this story wasn't over just yet. Sometimes, she thought, justice takes unexpected turns to find its way to the truth. James Martinez and Sarah Bennett sat in the courthouse cafeteria, where the reporter listened intently as she explained the full story behind the noise complaint. His eyes widened as she showed him photographs from the charity event on her phone, hundreds of people coming together, volunteers serving food, and families receiving much-needed support. 10 years, Sarah said softly, scrolling through the images. We've been doing this for 10 years. Started in my old backyard with just 20 people, and now we help thousands. Her voice carried no bitterness, only pride in what her community had accomplished. James shook his head, scribbling notes rapidly in his small notebook. And you raised how much this year? $127,000, Sarah replied. Every penny goes to Hope's Kitchen and our other programs. We feed over 300 people every week, provide job training, and help families find stable housing. The reporter paused his writing, looking up at Sarah with determination in his eyes. Judge Harrison needs to know about this. He's not a bad man, Miss Bennett. I've covered his cases for years. He's just stuck in his ways. At that moment, Judge Harrison himself walked into the cafeteria, his black robe swishing as he made his way to the coffee machine. James saw an opportunity and whispered, "Excuse me for a moment," before standing up and walking towards the judge. "Your Honor," James called out respectfully. "James Martinez from the Daily Chronicle. Could I have a moment of your time?" Judge Harrison turned, coffee cup in hand. "Mr. Martinez, you know I don't discuss cases outside my courtroom." "This isn't about a case, sir," James replied carefully. "It's about Hope's Kitchen. I'm working on a story about their incredible impact on our community. Did you know they've helped reduce homelessness in our county by 23% over the past 5 years?" The judge paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Hope's Kitchen?" "Yes, sir. The organization that just raised over $127,000 this weekend to support homeless families. The same event that received a noise complaint." James gestured subtly toward Sarah, who was still sitting at her table, reviewing documents for the shelter's next food drive. Judge Harrison's eyes followed James's gesture, and for the first time, he really looked at Sarah Bennett. Not as a case number or a noise violation, but as a person. He watched as she helped an elderly cafeteria worker who had dropped her tray, quickly but quietly assisting without drawing attention to herself. "Tell me more," the judge said quietly, his eyes still on Sarah. James pulled out his phone and showed Judge Harrison news articles from previous years. Photos of Sarah serving meals in the rain, stories of families who had found homes through her program, testimonials from people whose lives had been transformed through Hope's Kitchen. The noise complaint on Saturday, James explained, was from the setup of their annual fundraiser. They had all the proper permits. The music wasn't even loud, just gospel songs while volunteers arranged tables and chairs. Judge Harrison's face remained neutral, but his grip on his coffee cup tightened slightly. "Why didn't she say any of this in court?" "She tried, sir," James replied gently. "She had all the documentation with her." The judge stood silently for a moment, remembering how quickly he had dismissed her attempts to explain. He prided himself on running an efficient courtroom, but had efficiency come at the cost of justice. From across the cafeteria, Sarah's phone rang. She answered it, and even from a distance, they could see her face light up with joy. After hanging up, she immediately began making more calls, her excitement visible in her gestures. Curious, Judge Harrison watched as various people in the cafeteria, from janitors to lawyers, approached her table, each receiving warm smiles and what appeared to be thank yous from Sarah. "What's happening?" the judge asked James. "If I had to guess," James smiled, "someone just made a large donation to Hope's Kitchen. That's how she gets when more people will be able to receive help." Judge Harrison stood there, his coffee growing cold in his hand, watching as Sarah Bennett, the woman he had fined just an hour ago, continued spreading joy and hope throughout the room, completely unaware of his observation. "Mr. Martinez," the judge finally said, his voice carrying a weight of decision, "I believe I need to review this case more thoroughly." That evening, Judge Michael Harrison sat alone in his chambers, his desk covered with papers he had never expected to be reviewing. His dinner, a cold sandwich from the courthouse cafe, sat untouched at the corner of his desk as he pored over article after article about Hope's Kitchen and Sarah Bennett. The more he read, the more his conscience troubled him. A photograph from 3 years ago showed Sarah standing in pouring rain, holding an umbrella over a homeless elderly man while she got soaked herself. Another article detailed how she had used her entire savings to start the kitchen when the city had cut funding for homeless programs. "How did I miss this?" he muttered to himself, removing his reading glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. The judge opened his laptop and began searching through county records. Sarah Bennett's name appeared repeatedly, not for violations, but for community service awards, volunteer recognition, and charitable contributions. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter, Catherine, a social worker in the city. "Dad, heard you had Sarah Bennett in your courtroom today. Please tell me you didn't fine her." She's the reason my homeless shelter program works at all. Hope's Kitchen provides half our meals. The judge felt his stomach tighten. Even his own daughter knew about Sarah's work, yet he had been too rushed, too focused on maintaining his courtroom efficiency, to listen to a simple explanation. He picked up his office phone and dialed the courthouse clerk. "Janet, I need everything we have on the noise complaint against Sarah Bennett. Yes, from today's case. And get me the property records for Oakwood Heights, specifically for Mrs. Thompson." While waiting for the documents, Judge Harrison watched a video news report about Hope's Kitchen's latest initiative, a job training program that had helped 50 people find permanent employment in the past year. There was Sarah again, speaking not about herself but about the people she had helped, giving them all the credit for their success. Janet arrived with a thick folder. "Sir, I found something interesting," she said, pointing to Mrs. Thompson's property records. "She's filed similar noise complaints against 3 other neighbors in the past year. All were dismissed by other judges for lack of evidence." The judge nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. He pulled out the original noise complaint and studied Officer Jenkins' report more carefully this time. The officer had noted that the music was barely audible from the street, and that the complaint seemed possibly motivated by factors other than actual noise. What factors? Judge Harrison wondered aloud, though in his heart, he was beginning to understand the uncomfortable truth. He opened his email and found several messages from community leaders who had heard about the fine. The president of the local bank wrote about how Hope's Kitchen had transformed the neighborhood. A high school principal detailed how Sarah's program had helped dozens of struggling families keep their children fed and in school. As night fell outside his window, Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, confronting his own biases. He had seen a case number, not a person. He had heard a complaint without listening to the context. Most troublingly, he wondered how many other times he had done the same thing. His daughter called just as he was preparing to leave. "Dad," Catherine said, "do you know that Sarah Bennett spends every Christmas serving meals to families who can't afford holiday dinners?" "No, honey, I didn't know that," he replied quietly. "And do you know she visits senior homes every week to check on elderly residents who don't have families?" "I'm learning a lot about Ms. Bennett today," he admitted. "Dad," Catherine's voice softened, "she's the kind of person we need more of in this world, not someone who should be punished for helping others." After hanging up, Judge Harrison wrote 2 notes. The first was a court order vacating the fine against Sarah Bennett. The second was a personal letter requesting a meeting with her. As he drove home that night, the judge passed by Sarah's house in Oakwood Heights. The yard where the charity event had taken place was spotless. No trace of the weekend's activities remained. But now he saw something he had missed before, a small sign near the front door that read, "Hope Lives Here." For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, Judge Michael Harrison felt he had more to learn from a defendant than she had to learn from him. Judge Harrison spent the following morning in his chambers, canceling his usual court sessions. His fellow judges noticed something different about him. The usually strict and formal man seemed lost in thought, troubled even. He sat at his desk, reviewing case files from the past year, particularly those involving minority defendants. The stack of files grew larger as he requested more records. Each case reminded him of Sarah Bennett: quick judgments, interrupted explanations, and fines handed out with little consideration for circumstances. His coffee grew cold beside him as he made notes, his hands shaking slightly as patterns emerged that he had never noticed before. "Your Honor," his clerk knocked on the door. "Mrs. Thompson is here to see you about the noise complaint against Ms. Bennett." The judge straightened in his chair. "Send her in." Mrs. Thompson entered, her gray hair perfectly styled, wearing an expensive sweater set. She carried herself with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. "Judge Harrison," she smiled, "I wanted to personally thank you for handling that situation with those people. The neighborhood has been so much quieter." The judge watched her carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, please sit down. I'd like to discuss your previous complaints against your neighbors." Her smile faltered slightly. "Previous complaints?" "Yes," he said, opening a folder. "In the past year, you've filed noise complaints against the Garcia family, the Pattles, and the Williamses. All 3 complaints were dismissed." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "Interestingly, you've never filed complaints against any of your white neighbors, even during their graduation parties and backyard barbecues. Mrs. Thompson's face reddened. Well, aye, they were all very disruptive. Mrs. Thompson, the judge interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. I made a mistake yesterday. I acted on a complaint without proper investigation. That won't happen again. He stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse square where people of all backgrounds walked by. Do you know what Hope's Kitchen does for our community? I don't concern myself with, she began. Perhaps you should, he cut in, because while you've been filing complaints, Miss Bennett has been feeding hungry children, helping homeless families find homes, and making our community stronger. Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. Well, if they want to help people, they can do it somewhere else. Our neighborhood is exactly where it should be done, the judge finished. Mrs. Thompson, I'm dismissing your complaint against Ms. Bennett. Furthermore, I'm issuing a warning. Any future complaints will be thoroughly investigated for potential discriminatory motivation. After Mrs. Thompson left, clearly upset, Judge Harrison sank back into his chair. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, himself at his inauguration as judge, promising to uphold justice equally for all. Had he kept that promise? He pressed the intercom. Janet, please get me the statistics on all noise violation cases from the past 5 years. I want them broken down by neighborhood and defendant demographics. As he waited, he opened his laptop and started typing. Proposed changes to court procedures. 1. Mandatory full hearing for all defendants, regardless of violation type 2. Required documentation review before any judgment 3. Regular review of pattern complaints 4. Community impact assessment for all fines. The list grew longer as he thought about Sarah Bennett and how close he had come to punishing someone for making their community better. His phone buzzed with a message from his daughter. Dad, heard you're making changes. Proud of you. Later that afternoon, he walked through the courthouse halls, noticing things he had overlooked before. The nervous mothers trying to explain their situations, the elderly struggling to understand legal procedures, the young people who couldn't afford to miss work for court dates. He stopped at the courthouse bulletin board and saw a flyer for Hope's Kitchen's next event. Without hesitation, he took out his pen and wrote his name on the volunteer sign-up sheet. A passing clerk stopped in surprise. Your Honor, are you volunteering? Judge Harrison nodded, still writing. It's time I learned about the community I serve, don't you think? He looked up at the clerk. Sometimes, the best way to serve justice is to first understand the people we're serving. On Saturday morning, Judge Harrison parked his car a block away from Hope's Kitchen. He wore jeans and a plain blue shirt instead of his usual suit, trying to blend in with the other volunteers. His heart beat faster as he approached the busy community center, where dozens of people were already setting up for the day's event. The smell of fresh coffee and baking bread filled the air. Through the windows, you could see Sarah Bennett directing volunteers, her warm smile encouraging everyone around her. She wore a simple apron with Hope's Kitchen written across the front, moving between stations with natural grace and authority. Taking a deep breath, the judge walked inside. A young volunteer greeted him with a clipboard. Are you here to help? We can always use more hands. Yes, he said quietly. I signed up earlier this week. Michael Harrison. The volunteer checked her list, and her eyes widened slightly as she recognized his name. But before she could say anything, another voice called out, We need help in the kitchen. Anyone available? Judge Harrison raised his hand. I can help. He followed the voice to the kitchen, where he found himself handed an apron and directed to a sink full of vegetables that needed washing. For the next hour, he worked silently, washing carrots and potatoes, listening to the conversations around him. He heard stories of people who had found hope through this program, a single mother who now had a stable job, an elderly man who no longer had to choose between medicine and food, a teenager who had received a scholarship through Hope's Kitchen's education program. Sarah moved through the kitchen, checking on everyone's progress. When she reached the judge's station, she stopped, surprise flickering across her face, but instead of drawing attention to his presence, she simply asked, How are those vegetables coming along? Almost done, he replied, unable to meet her eyes. Where would you like them? John needs them for the soup, she said kindly. And thank you for helping. Every pair of hands makes a difference. As the morning progressed, Judge Harrison found himself doing things he'd never done before. Chopping onions alongside a former homeless man who now worked as a chef, serving coffee to elderly visitors who blessed him with bright smiles, and listening to stories from people who had known hardship he could barely imagine. Around noon, the community center filled with people from all walks of life. The judge watched as Sarah greeted each person by name, remembering their stories, their children, their struggles and victories. He saw Mrs. Thompson's complaint for what it truly was, not about noise, but about fear of something she didn't understand. A small girl tugged at his apron. "Can I have more bread, please?" "Of course," he said, reaching for the basket. As he handed her a roll, he asked, "Do you come here often?" "Every Saturday," she beamed. "Miss Sarah helped my mommy find a job, and now we have our own apartment. But we still come because everyone here is family." The word family stuck with him as he continued serving. He watched as people from different backgrounds sat together, sharing meals and stories. There was no distinction between those serving and those being served. Everyone was treated with the same dignity and respect. Late in the afternoon, as they were cleaning up, Sarah finally approached him directly. "Your Honor," she said softly, so others couldn't hear, "thank you for coming. But may I ask why?" Judge Harrison put down the broom he was holding. "Because I needed to see what justice really looks like, Ms. Bennett. It's not always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found in a kitchen, serving hope one meal at a time." Sarah studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Same time next week?" The judge looked around at the community center, at the lives being changed, at the barriers being broken down one conversation at a time. He thought about his comfortable chambers at the courthouse, where he had spent years making judgments without truly understanding the community he served. "Same time next week," he confirmed, reaching for another bag of trash to take out. As he worked, he realized that today, in this simple community kitchen, he had learned more about justice than in 20 years on the bench. Monday morning arrived with a different atmosphere in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The usual tension was replaced by something new as Sarah Bennett sat in his chambers, not as a defendant this time, but as an invited guest. The judge had arranged this meeting through proper channels, and his secretary had made sure Sarah knew this wasn't about her case. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison began, standing as she entered. His voice carried a weight of humility that his staff had never heard before. "Thank you for coming." Sarah sat in the leather chair across from his desk, her posture relaxed but dignified. The morning sun streaming through the window highlighted the grace in her features, the wisdom in her eyes that came from years of serving others. "Before I say anything else," the judge continued, pulling out an official document, "I want you to know that I've completely dismissed the noise violation, but that's not why I asked you here today." He walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse square where people rushed about their morning routines. "Saturday at Hope's Kitchen changed something in me, Ms. Bennett. I saw justice being served in ways I never understood before." Sarah listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The judge turned back to face her. "For 20 years, I've sat on this bench, believing I was serving justice by following the letter of the law. But I failed to see the spirit of it." His voice cracked slightly. "I failed to see people like you, who make our community better, stronger." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "I've spent the past week reviewing every case I've handled in the last year. The patterns I found." He shook his head. "They're troubling. My quick judgments, my interruptions, my assumptions, they've hurt people who deserve to be heard." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor, we all have moments when we need to step back and reconsider our actions." "Please," he said, "call me Michael." He sat down, meeting her eyes directly. "Miss Bennett, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt of gratitude. You've opened my eyes to what true community service means." He pulled out another document, this one bearing the court's official seal. "I've drafted new guidelines for handling cases in my courtroom. Every defendant will have the right to full explanation. Every case will be reviewed for context. But I need your help." Sarah raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I want to establish a community advisory board," he explained, spreading out several papers. "A group that will help the court understand the human impact of our decisions. Would you consider being its first chairperson?" Sarah took a moment before responding, her eyes scanning the proposal. "This is a significant change, Judge Michael. Are you sure the other judges will support it? He smiled slightly. 3 have already agreed to implement similar changes in their courtrooms. Your story, your work. It's creating ripples throughout our judicial system. Tears formed in Sarah's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. Sometimes, she said softly, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. Judge Harrison nodded, remembering the little girl at Hope's kitchen asking for more bread. I've learned that justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about understanding the people those laws are meant to serve. He pulled out one final document, his letter of apology, officially entered into court records. I want this to be remembered. Not just my mistake, but the lesson it taught all of us. Sarah reached across the desk and gently touched the letter. This isn't about punishment or blame anymore. It's about growth and change. The judge stood, extending his hand. Will you help us build a better system, Ms. Bennett? One that serves everyone with true understanding and compassion. Sarah stood as well, taking his offered hand. Yes, she said firmly. Because that's what hope is all about, believing that we can make things better, one person, one decision at a time. As they shook hands, both knew that this moment was more than just an apology or a new beginning. It was a bridge being built between 2 worlds that had been separated for far too long by misunderstanding and prejudice. 1 year later, the community center buzzed with excitement as people gathered for Hope's Kitchen's 11th annual fundraiser. The space had doubled in size, thanks to the new partnership between the community and the local court system. Judge Michael Harrison, no longer in his judicial robes but wearing a Hope's Kitchen apron, stood beside Sarah Bennett as they welcomed guests. Can you believe how much has changed in just 1 year? Sarah asked, watching as volunteers, including 3 other judges and several court officials, moved through the crowd serving food and drinks. The walls were covered with photographs showing the impact of their combined efforts over the past year. The numbers spoke for themselves. Homelessness in the county had decreased by 40%. The new legal aid program, born from their partnership, had helped over 500 families avoid eviction. Job training programs had placed more than 200 people in permanent positions, but the biggest change was visible in the faces around them. Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor who had filed the original complaint, sat at a table with the Garcia family, laughing as their children played nearby. After several conversations with Sarah and witnessing the impact of Hope's Kitchen, she had become one of their most dedicated volunteers. Michael, called out Catherine, the judge's daughter, as she hurried over with a newspaper. Have you seen this? She handed her father the morning's paper, where a front-page article highlighted their program as a model for other cities. The headline read, From Courtroom to Kitchen, How One Misunderstanding Transformed a Community's Approach to Justice. Judge Harrison smiled as he read the article. It detailed how the Community Advisory Board, under Sarah's leadership, had helped reform the local justice system. Cases were now heard with fuller context, and community service at Hope's Kitchen had become a popular alternative to fines for minor offenses. Dad, Catherine said softly, I've never been prouder to be your daughter. As they talked, a young man approached Sarah. She recognized him from a case 3 months ago. He had been caught stealing food to feed his family. Instead of jail time, Judge Harrison had connected him with Hope's Kitchen's programs. Now he worked as a certified chef at a local restaurant. Ms. Bennett, Judge Harrison, he said, holding out an envelope. This is my first paycheck. I want to donate part of it to help others like me. Sarah hugged him tightly, while the judge wiped away a tear. This was what real justice looked like, not just punishment, but transformation. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Sarah and Judge Harrison sat down for a quiet moment. The sound of children laughing and people chatting filled the air with joy. You know, the judge said, looking around at what they had built together, when I found you that day, I thought I was upholding the law. I never imagined I was about to learn its true purpose. Sarah smiled, watching as a former defendant helped an elderly woman to her car. Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. The funny thing is, he replied, I thought I was the one teaching lessons from the bench. Turns out I had the most to learn. As they sat there, a new family walked in, recently homeless, looking nervous and unsure. Without hesitation, both Sarah and the judge stood up to welcome them, showing that hope had no closing hours. Ready for another year? Sarah asked, leading the family to a table. Judge Harrison nodded, already reaching for an extra plate of food. Ready for many more, because justice isn't just served in courtrooms. It's served in kitchens, Sarah finished, one plate of hope at a time. Above them, a new sign hung on the wall, combining the scales of justice with a heart. Hope's Kitchen, where justice meets compassion. And below it, in smaller letters, everyone deserves a second chance, a warm meal, and someone who believes in them. The story of a noise complaint that could have divided a community had instead united it, reminding everyone that true justice comes not from quick judgments, but from taking the time to understand, learn, and grow together.